Now tell me about your subsequent conversation with Mr Kennett about that investment.
Well, he came around 3 or 4 days later, I think, and he was very excited. And he came around and he told me that even though they had promised him 20,000, he actually still applied for the original 100,000. As it turned out, he sent off the original 20,000, and then I think later that day he sent off a second cheque for 80,000 shares at 78 cents each. And he was very excited because they'd given him 50,000, which was more than they'd said. So he was quite chipper about, oh, well, they'd said they'd give me 20, I wrote off for 100, and they've actually given me 50.
So he'd got 30,000 more than had been agreed to on the phone.
Yeah, he got 150% more than had been agreed, and clearly what happened was he wrote off to Richard Lee and sent his application in. Richard Lee was in awe of the Premier. The tone of the conversation was that he was just cock-a-hoop that the Premier had rung him, taking an interest in his float, and was doing anything to please. And so, from my reading of that, it was a case of the implied pressure of, you want to please the Premier, you've said you'll give him some shares. Heck, was there some confusion as to how many we agreed to? I thought we agreed to 20, but he sent off for 100. Perhaps he didn't get my message right. Perhaps there was some sort of misunderstanding. As it turned out, he got an extra 30,000, or Felicity got an extra 30,000 shares. And when the float came on at almost 40% above the issue price, that was sort of $8,000 profit on day one.
So what was Mr Kennett's reaction to having got the extra shares?
Oh, he was cock-a-hoop. He thought this was fantastic, that he'd sort of somehow beaten the system. Not only had he got on this float, but he'd got on much bigger than the chief underwriter of the whole offer had agreed to, and he thought that was fantastic.
Do you recall anything specific he said about that?
Oh, he just said, sort of glowingly, that he actually wrote off for 100,000, and they've given him 50, not 20. So he was very excited.
And what view did you take of that extra allocation having been made?
Well, I thought that clearly that was the implied pressure of an application from the Premier or his wife, and they sort of obviously didn't want to offend him. I presume somehow the Chinese tradition didn't want to offend him, and therefore obviously cut someone else back by even more to give Felicity 50,000 shares. Now, when you consider that the TAC and work cover, which together managed $7 billion of Victorian money, which is controlled by the government effectively, when you consider that they had both been cut back to 50,000 shares each about 4 or 5 days earlier, well then, that decision had already been taken before then. So clearly, to accommodate Felicity's 50,000, because the application did come in quite late, they've obviously cut someone else back by 50,000 shares to squeeze them in. Now, normally in floats, institutions such as the TAC and work cover would get probably 50 to 100 times more shares than your typical normal small investor. Now, to have a situation where the TAC is getting cut back to 50,000, work cover is getting cut back to 50,000, and the Premier's wife's getting cut back to 50,000 is unprecedented. I've never seen any float in which a member of the public is treated the same way as an institution managing $4 billion of funds for 3 million Victorian motorists. It's extraordinary. And the only conclusion you can make is that the Premier's wife received special treatment.
What did Mr Kennett say to you after the event about his investment?
Well, I think when the shares came on, I think it was on the 28th of September in '93, and they came on at, I think it was $1.15. Again, he was cock-a-hoop, and I think there was a general conversation that, well, on 50,000 shares at $1.15, he was about 8,000 in front, and what a great day. And yeah, he was very chipper.
Mr Kennett said later that they were his wife's shares.
Well, in name only. I mean, he met these people beforehand. He hosted a government-funded reception for them at Parliament on September 28. He rang Matheson, he rang Richard Lee, he organised for the broker to send off the applications. I'd be surprised if Mrs Kennett even knew that she was making this very large investment, $78,000 application, $39,000 investment.
So what did you make of the Premier telling Parliament the day after the story broke, "The first point I make is the shares are not held by me"?
Well, clearly it's very cute. I mean, he systematically put in train a process whereby the shares would not be disclosed and he would not have to reveal them. And then I can recall when working in there that there were other instances, particularly with K&F advertising business, where the strategy was to make this out as an attack on the Premier's wife, make people look like they're picking on Felicity. And that's the political strategy here. This is how we get around this. And clearly this was just another repeat of the K&F strategy, is how dare you attack my wife. My wife is not a politician. She's free to do what she likes. Whereas at the end of the day, Mrs. Kennett was a vehicle for a ploy, a plan put together entirely by Mr. Kennett from his office to make as much quick money on a hot float, and she was an innocent victim, if you like, of his money making ambitions, and then was used as the person to hide behind as part of the political strategy to avoid to dampen the fallout.
Mr. Kennett's full explanation was that they were his wife's shares, the company was not based in Australia, the company had no business with the government, and it was not a company that he or his wife could influence. Therefore, there was no obligation to disclose. What would you say about those points?
I think correct. He won't deal with it. They were in his wife's name, only by name. I mean, he drove that. I would have thought that the disclosure was absolutely crucial because he facilitated the investment from his office. So the clear conflict of interest was not in that he would have future dealings with the company. It was that he abused his position to get an extraordinarily large allocation in a hot float. And I would have thought that on those grounds that you would clearly have to disclose. But if he had disclosed, well, then he would have been staring a controversy in the face straight away, because people would have said, hang on, how did the Premier's wife appear to get the largest single allocation to an individual Australian investor of anyone in what was the hottest float of 1993? And that would beg the obvious question as to what's going on here. So clearly it should have been disclosed. The Premier knew that if it was disclosed, there'd probably be questions raised.